I would have thought that many of the things I'm going to say a little later on would go without saying, but it seems that some things need saying. There are many evil people in our country that do not care about how they win their agendas. We're seeing what happens when you just play the game. The culture and the people and the country and the politics are all related and affect one another in a complex, interactive web. It's not a game, and yet it is made that way. How you win should be just as important as winning, but it isn't. The left has adopted a win at any cost policy. They don't care what lies they need to tell. They don't care about young people. They don't care about hardworking people, and they certainly don't care about upending the Enlightenment era principles that our Constitution was founded on. And that means that future generations will pay for the errors of their parents. The phrase might makes right, for instance, may be used by socialists to undermine a deeper and more subtle meaning that is tied to many religious beliefs, including Christianity. And I will discuss this indirectly at first and then explicitly later on. There have been many modern 20th century ideas that emerge in stark contrast to the Enlightenment era principles under the guise of critiquing medieval era notions of righteousness. One that has been conflated so much is might makes right. It has been conflated so much that it's difficult anymore to see a pure intent on the part of the critics. Might, of course, doesn't necessarily make you right, but the might makes right backlash, if you will, that has been integrated into the compassion-based socialist mantra of the past century has been conflated with never using force and submitting power to the weak for the sake of yielding power from strong to weak. Yielding power from the strong to the weak is not in any way in and of itself a moral or just action. In fact, by saturating young people with the notion that might makes right is entirely and wholly wrong and evil, we see the evil of the idea of compassion as a moral and just cause and action. Again, in and of itself, it is absolutely not moral or just. Decades of cultural and societal changes has destroyed the ideal of strength, of hard work, of individual growth, rights, freedoms, etc. In short, we've encouraged weakness, and that's what we have as a result. Ironically, those that work hard and are the quote-unquote mighty have largely become the victims, while the weak live off welfare generated by taxing those mighty, with the exception, of course, of the top 10 or 20% or so of the population that have successfully shielded themselves from this backlash, as well as flourished. This has been the truth. A backlash against compassion as a governmental and cultural policy is long overdue, lest the West spiral into decay rapidly towards that similar to third world nations. This hasn't happened overnight, and as a result it's near impossible to assign blame to anyone, and certainly not to the unwitting masses. People do what they need to survive, and they take the path of least resistance instinctively, and no one can blame people for following in the footsteps of a broken system and doing what they need to do to survive and live their lives. Nevertheless, the ongoing socialist feminist doctrine, combined with residual effects of decades past social media-based, entertainment-based, and school-based indoctrination, is destroying the ideals of the individual in America for the future of people living today and future generations. This highlights the dangers of oversimplifying, which is ironic because the phrase being critiqued was an oversimplification, perhaps intentional. So you would think that those like the late T.H. White, for instance, would have been more objective and cautious in his critique of it, for instance, in The Once and Future King. Anyone who knows anything about the concept of local versus global, or the very big versus the very small in a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics field, knows that a fundamental principle that may apply to something very small may not apply or work or apply to something very large, or vice versa. In this case, the same applies for the non-STEM principle of might makes right. It is not necessarily right for the local, quote unquote, but if you look at the big picture, I think most people believe, or at least want to believe, that good triumphs over evil for life, earth, and time, which is to say that at the end of days, or in the end, quote unquote, good triumphs over evil. So although there may be very bad things that happen along the way, God has a plan, as it is often said, that leads to the ultimate triumph of good over evil. Again, this is something completely overlooked when considering the principle of might makes right. However, what do we get out of this? In a STEM field, we can quantify to some extent when a principle stops working based off of the relative size of whatever is under consideration. Consider Newtonian physics versus Einstein's theory of relativity. As objects approach the speed of light, consider this as the very big, i.e., quote-unquote global, Newtonian physics becomes erroneous because Einstein realized that light can be thought of as a speed limit in the universe. However, Newtonian physics works astoundingly well for most ordinary human activities. Think of this as the very small, i.e., the quote-unquote local, such as walking, running, or driving. There is also the literal global issue in science of planets, planetary bodies, and black holes, and thus gravity, and what scientists understand about it conflicting with what they understand about how subatomic particles behave, i.e. quantum physics. However, this is all to say that science can, to some extent, quantify when principles stop applying to certain things in the universe and are replaced with other principles. It is very difficult to do anything of the sort when considering non-STEM related fields. If might makes right on the most global, quote-unquote, sense, then how do you define global and how do you define local? The human race could be around for another century or 20 millennia. That time-based constraint alone affects how we weigh the magnitude of certain actions in the grand scheme of things. But there are also many other constraints such as space occupied on Earth, population, war, potential space exploration, potential other scientific discoveries that expand lifespan, human development, artificial intelligence, and the list goes on. So doesn't this all make the idea of might makes right and other non-STEM principles virtually meaningless? And I would say to that, no. We can do at least one thing with that quote and quote-unquote principle, which is to internalize it. We can't apply it logically to anything that is occurring outside of us, but we can apply it to ourselves, to the individual. We are all individuals, after all. We came into this world that way, and we will all meet our Maker in that way. By internalizing principles such as might makes right, our path to God becomes clear. If God exists, then He sees genocide and war and evil things. But if those things do not happen, then life and laws and prosperity may not happen as well. We simply don't know God's grand plan if you happen to believe in God. We know this because God watches over all things, the bad and the good, as they unfold to reveal the truth. If evil things didn't happen, good things may not have happened. But does that make the evil things good and perhaps the good things evil? Again, no. But by understanding the dynamic between good and evil, the importance of internalizing the principle, in this case of might makes right, is revealed. Each of us should hold in our hearts and minds that what we do is right and good, and that we individually need to be stronger so that good prevails. And I know that if everyone believes that, and because most people believe what they are doing is right and good, necessarily means that quote-unquote evil people will believe what they are doing is right and that they have to prevail because of it. And what I would say to that is that everything will unfold over time in the grand scheme of things until the truth of God or of existence is revealed. Good will prevail, so don't be ashamed of your natural God-given life and all the health, strength, desires, and so on that it gives. Strength doesn't necessarily mean that you're that you're right in what you're doing on a case-by-case basis, but it should never be construed to mean you're wrong or evil in the same breath. Because if you recognize your own existence and you believe that life is cyclical, at least until the end, that every small end is a new beginning, and that good triumphs at the end, at every end there is, now until the end of time, and good finally triumphs forever, then might does make right in this grandest of grand sense. And if you're an atheist, then perhaps that means there is no truth of God or existence. But in that case, nothing matters, and the only meaning is the meaning that you insert yourself. This is singular in nature, which to me is akin to spontaneous combustion. If you can think, after all, you can insert your own meaning to various aspects of life. Then you are, and we are all, walking, talking contradictions to atheism. Nevertheless, I believe that the general meaning of what I have said here is still compatible, and certainly not incompatible, with virtually all religious beliefs and atheism, despite my confusion at its fundamental premise. Overall, T.H. White's The Once and Future King is not without merit, and since I mentioned it, I do encourage people to read it and to compare it to Sir Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur. Considering, however, that when one does a search on Google or shopping on Amazon today, that The Once and Future King tends to show up before Malory's edition, as well as the fact that The Once and Future King receives a lot of critical praise, I would have to say that White's version is criminally overrated. The first part of White's novel, The Sword and the Stone, I enjoyed, but as later books came, there was a lot more to dislike. And I believe an intentional distaste and distortion of the original Arthurian legends.